Hey there! Thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris, and welcome to another episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews, where I review all of the fan-created, canonized Bionicle models. These are models that are not official LEGO sets, but actually have been canonized and accepted into the Bionicle G1 story, either by official LEGO contests like the Dark Hunters and Rahi contest from 2005/2006, or even the TTV canonization contests, which are a little bit more ongoing and modern, and currently overseen by Greg Farshty, the story lead for Bionicle Generation 1 in its later years. Today we have yet another LEGO Dark Hunter Bionicle Fanon review. In this case, we'll be taking a look at the Dark Hunter Charger. Now, Charger's backstory is a pretty interesting one. The official story behind him is that he was actually a Kane Ra bull, yes, those Rahi from the 2001 Madanui saga, who was transformed by a Rotuka spinner into a Dark Hunter. So with that, he gained some limited sentience, although he kind of still has an animalistic instinct, and usually they just use him as a blunt force weapon to point at a direction of something that they want destroyed. He's a very simple character. He just has a hatred for Muwaka, which is pretty funny because Kane Ra and Muwaka were pitted as opponents in that one Rahi set, and he very much has retained some of his Rahi instincts. So he's very much half beast, half man, really just mostly beast. And that's really all there is to him. There isn't really any more deep lore or backstory that goes behind Charger. But so let's start by taking a look at how I'm actually going to review this model. If you're new to these series, I'll be reviewing these models on 4 major points. Number 1 is posability. How well does a model pose? Can they hold the weight of their own weapon? And can they stand up without continually falling down? Number 2 is building techniques. So is this just taking pieces from sets and repurposing them here and there, or is it actually using some more interesting building techniques? And number 3 is overall aesthetics. So completely ignoring the story, does it look good? Does it look menacing? Does this look like a fearsome Dark Hunter? And finally, number 4 is considering the backstory and its place in the Bionicle universe. Does the appearance of this character make sense? Would I look at this and say that this makes sense in the Bionicle universe? And specifically, does this look like, in this case, a Kane Ra bull that's been transformed? So we'll be taking a look at that and more as we get into this review. So without further ado, let's just get started and take a look at Charger, the former Kane Ra bull and now Dark Hunter, right now. Okay, so let's start things off with a 360-degree turnaround of Charger as usual, so you can see him in all his glory and take a look at all of the different poses and building techniques that he can do. I do want to note a few minor things. I've actually swapped out this piece and this piece from dark gray to dark red. I believe it makes the color scheme work out a little bit better that way, and also, quite frankly, these were just the pieces I had on hand that happened to work with this color scheme, although I'll definitely be making a note of that in aesthetics because it does make a very minor change to how he looks. Hopefully it's not too major, and other than that, pretty much everything else is the same, except for one other thing. The actual model calls for you to chop the Tahu blade pieces, cut off the flame, and just make them blades. I'm really not one to cut or modify LEGO pieces, so I left them as is. Honestly, I think they look fine. Sure, you lose some of the look of the more narrow blades, but I think it's a pretty okay compromise, and I'm really against just using any sort of modification via cutting or chopping to any LEGO pieces, so I'm definitely not going to do that, although there's nothing stopping you from doing it if you want to build this model yourself. But so, now that we've taken a look at him at all angles, let's just take him off the rotating platform here and start to take a look at Charger as a model himself. Alright, so the first thing I want to start with here is posability. You can get him into some pretty interesting poses, although I will say right away, he cannot really hold the weight of his own weapon. His arm will droop down, so unless you have the base of the spear planted on the ground, or planted even on his foot, he really can't hold up the weight of his weapon, which is a bit of a shame. But moving on, starting off actually with the legs, they've actually done a pretty interesting thing here to give him some animalistic Rahi-like legs. These are actually digitigrade legs, kind of like the ones that centaurs have. They're meant to look more like an animal, and as such they have multiple joints, which actually fits the Kane Ra/bull aspect quite well, because in real life animal legs do look like this. He basically has different segments where you'd think that the foot would end here, but they actually cleverly placed a Throbot's gear piece / Nui Jaga activator here to actually connect another foot to the base here to cause him to look like he has hooves. I actually especially like the parts usage of the Pohatu Nuva foot attachment piece because this actually looks like the hooves on an animal and makes it even look a lot more like the concept of this being a mutated Kane Ra bull. Moving on to up here, the one strange thing about the arms is that the way that they are mounted incorporates this tiny little joint here used for the Rahaga, used for Axon's fingers and whatnot, and they have it kind of mounted as some shoulder articulation, which I guess is good, but it does kind of feel strange to me. It really just feels like they didn't have the right pieces to attach the ball joint onto a certain angle onto here, so they had to kind of come up with this in-between piece. So it is a little bit awkward at times and especially can stand out when posing, but it's not a huge deal because especially when you're moving around this arm, which isn't holding anything, it generally can hold its own weight and move around. The same cannot be said for this arm, which uses the same system, but again, the weapon just makes it really not be able to stand upright, especially when attached to that other ball joint. Speaking of, moving up towards here, we can take a look at his head, which generally is just the standard Vaki head, although they have actually put the horns along the side, which makes sense because of the Kane Ra bull. And they've also included a Rakshi spine piece back here, which I'm presuming is some sort of a curve on the back of his neck, which I honestly think does work out relatively well, although if you look at it from the side, it is quite gappy. You can very clearly see that this is just kind of something that hangs off the back and not actually part of his head moving, although I do appreciate the effort, especially given this was made in a time where usually the building techniques were a little less refined than this. In the back, he has one more little funny piece of articulation here. They've actually managed to include a little tail just by that Nui Jaga activator gear piece, so it is actually one that works out pretty well for this model. Unfortunately, though, it's very easy to get out of whack because you see these two gray Technic pieces here actually hold the Toametru feet in, and it's not a legal connection. They kind of just hold in because of friction. As you can see, it's very easy, especially when moving the tail, to kind of get this out of whack. And immediately the contours of the body kind of fall apart because, as you can see, these are not adhered by any friction whatsoever. They kind of just flop around, and you just have to squeeze them together to make them contour to the right shape. Looking at this from the front, let me just show you how that would look. From the front angle, when everything's put together, it actually looks pretty good because it looks like they used these special pieces, the Toametru foot pieces, to add some depth to the body. But as soon as they separate, the illusion is broken and they really just flop around and make it hard to pose. So it's definitely a bit of a con the way these are attached. I really wish that they were attached in a bit more of a stronger connection way because that would really prevent things from flopping around too much on this body here. Then speaking of flopping around, because of the way the legs are built, this thing is kind of difficult to pose. Add on to the fact that he can't really wield his weapon all that well, and he can tend to very easily fall over and backwards. It's not nearly as bad as some of the other models, but it is still not great, and I definitely would have wanted to see at least some improvements be made to the strength of the legs. That being said, this is again something that can be very easily fixed by these CCBS friction add-on pieces, which I definitely will add on to this model after the review. I think it's just a matter of the legs being the way that they are, and especially the feet pieces not being attached correctly. 99% of the problems would be solved if there was a friction add-on to the feet here, because that's really where it starts to fall over. Let me get this in a camera view where you can actually see the feet on the ground. If I plant the feet on the ground, you can see that it's immediately falling over because of the feet. And even if you try to wiggle it into a generally good pose, let's say something like this, he can still very easily fall over. It's not really the best design. They definitely traded posability for aesthetics, which is something we'll get into when we review those points, because I have to say these look quite good. They look like bull legs. It's just that unfortunately they sacrificed posability a bit, and honestly if he had normal legs and just kind of stood like this, it wouldn't have nearly as many problems. But you take away from a lot of the aesthetics and kind of standardize him. So I am glad that they did legs like this. It kind of makes him stand out amongst Bionicle characters. It just is not the most flexible and posable thing. But then moving on, I want to specifically call out the way that you can move around the hands because of the way that the Tahu Nuva fire swords are attached. Obviously, I did not chop them, so you can't really move the arms in too much, but the hands are actually fixed. Although, honestly, it's not a huge deal because you can still move them around, and I actually think that it fits pretty well alongside the groove of this arm piece, so I don't really have anything too badly against that. But then moving on to the weapon here, I will say it is relatively simplistic, although it does do its job. You can see a very just simple spike here, the Vaki staff piece alongside a Rakshi spine held in by a little bit of an awkward Technic pin right here. I do think that that red piece may be supposed to be in black, but still it's kind of awkward how this axle sticks out. But then again, if they didn't have this piece, this would just flop around due to the nature of the Rakshi spine, so they did what they had to do to keep the aesthetics. Overall, I think that aesthetics-wise, this model actually shows a lot of competence. It's not like many of the other Dark Hunters who kind of fall apart in terms of aesthetics with clashing color schemes and whatnot. This one actually does a relatively decent job of having both a consistent color scheme of red tapering down to dark gray along the edges of his limbs, but also manages to have a full bull-like stature that I do feel is very authentic to an actual bull. From the way the legs are done, to the shape of the head, to even the tail in the back, I think there's a really great attention to detail here, and really sells me on the fact that this is a Kane-Ra that's been transformed. Aesthetics-wise, it's pretty good. Of course, there are some gaps over here, like you can't really tell what this is supposed to be on the back, and obviously if the legs or the Toamata feet pieces get misaligned, that doesn't do anything in terms of aesthetics. It really doesn't look that great. But if you have them secured onto the back and you have everything built the way it's supposed to, I'd say aesthetics-wise, this model is not bad at all. I really am sold on the fact that it is a bull that has been transformed into a humanoid, and it really conveys that quite well in the design language. Now, of course, there are quite a few numerous cons to this model, both aesthetics-wise and build-wise, but I will say that overall, aesthetically, it is pretty pleasing. But now is a good time to move on to the final point of this review, which is how well does it make sense in universe, where I'll be comparing him alongside some representative samples, aka a Kane-Ra, and trying to see some design similarities between them. So let's step out and take a look at the final point, making sense in the universe. Alright, but zooming out for the final point here, I've brought over just one very accurate and relevant comparison model here. This is the official Kane-Ra model from 2001 from the Bionicle set line, and this is Charger, who is supposed to be this, but transformed. Immediately I can see some pretty good similarities. Obviously they use the same exact horn piece in a different color, and the hooves on the Kane-Ra are actually replicated quite well with the legs of Charger. Of course, one of the coolest things about this is I think the back tread. Obviously this was a very strange feature of the Kane-Ra, which really was just supposed to be a play feature, but I actually kind of like how his back tail has these gear bits on them to actually kind of mimic the look of that tread, almost like that was the part that became this part over here. Of course, there are a few things that are a little bit different. The Kane-Ra don't normally have these spikes coming out of their arms, and I'm still not really sure what this back Rakshi spine piece was supposed to represent, other than maybe the contours of his neck, but I'd say it's a pretty good representation, and a good translation of what this animal would look like had it been transformed into a humanoid figure. I imagine these legs just getting longer, this back piece just turning into the tail, and the head just shaping into this, becoming a little bit smaller. So I definitely can see the resemblance between them, which I think is a pretty good thing. But then moving on from that point, I want to get into the final scoring points of this model. It is a bit of a smaller one than usual, but it is still quite interesting. Starting off, I guess, with believability in universe, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 in terms of that. I think that it fits in very well. It does look like a Kane-Ra. There are a few very minor things that don't make too much sense to me. Specifically, the way that the shoulders are mounted feel a little bit strange, or feels like too many joints, especially for a Kane-Ra bull type character. I also do feel like the gappiness does hurt it a little bit in terms of just not feeling that realistic, although to be fair, there were quite a few official Bionicle Titans that were gappy. But then moving on to aesthetics. So aesthetics, I would say, completely ignoring the fragility or stability or anything like that, I'm also going to give aesthetics an 8 out of 10. And the reason I say this is because this does a lot of things right. For example, the way that the legs are built actually look like an animal's legs. It looks like the Kane-Ra's legs. The way that the torso is built is actually pretty solid, and ignoring some of the awkward stuff that happens when you get these pieces misaligned, it looks like a solid animal body. But then you get to some strange stuff like the extra joints on the arms that really don't do anything in terms of articulation. You get to stuff like the really gappiness of the head right here that doesn't allow you to really see right through it. Even when moving the head around, it's a bit of a pain to get this Rakshi's spine out of the way. And then there's also some stuff, even on his weapon, that feels kind of awkward with this random Technic axle just sticking out way too far, further than it should be. So with a combination of that, I think an 8 out of 10 is pretty deserved for this model. It aesthetically looks like what it's supposed to be for the most part, although there are a few things that I wish could be improved. And then the next point up is posability. So posability, I think, is where it's going to suffer the most. And the reason I say that is because you saw how difficult it was to even get the legs in the right pose, or it doesn't just fall over or have the legs fall apart. The other thing that kind of bugs me is the way that he can't support the weight of his own weapon all that well without it kind of flopping down. You can't really get it into the perfect position, and it's really kind of a pain to fiddle around with these legs to pose them to look good without him actually falling over. So those are definitely all cons that are contributing to posability, which is why I'm going to give posability a 6 out of 10. Obviously, it was traded for aesthetics. Aesthetics definitely looks a lot better, whereas posability, if you can get it into a good pose, it looks all right, but it's kind of difficult to do so without it falling over. But then for the final point, we move on to building techniques. And I'm going to give building techniques actually a 7 out of 10 here. There's a lot of things that have been done right. It's very simple because obviously you're just connecting pieces together, but the parts usages are actually quite nice and quite unique and reminiscent of the Kanira bull. From the tail having these spikes around it and being curved exactly like the tread on the back of the Kanira, to the actual usage of these spike pieces to evoke the head, and even the way that the feet are built to extend the feet outwards to make it more animalistic. Those are all things that I really like. But then again, there's a lot of really awkward things, like for example, the Toa Metru feet just flopping around, having to adhere to the back here by a pretty illegal technique. I mean, you're just squeezing them together and hoping they stay. These are all kind of things that contribute to the awkwardness of this model, and the way that it's built doesn't really do it any favors. But it is still one of the better Dark Hunters, and especially one of the ones that is visually consistent and not just a blob of pieces. The builder knew how to use the pieces, where to use them, and how to use them well, which I think is a pretty good thing, and definitely shows a sign of actually some talent and skill being behind the way that this is built. But with that, that about wraps up our review of Charger, the once Kanira bull mutated into a humanoid. Funnily enough, I'm actually doing this video now because someone recommended, and I actually agree. It was kind of a funny coincidence that this year, for Chinese New Year, is the year of the bull. So what better way to celebrate Chinese New Year than reviewing the Bionicle half man, half bull? Alright, so with that, I think it's a good way to close this up. Thank you all for tuning into Duckbricks, and let me know down in the comments below what kinds of models would you like to see reviewed next. I am always continually working on reviews, and at any given moment I have several recorded and edited and even uploaded. So every single Monday, come in every week to check out a new Bionicle Fanon review. Thank you all for tuning in, and stay tuned for the next review coming out very soon. Thanks, and bye-bye for now.